Listening to spirit guides? What? Welcome to the Joyous Expansion Podcast. I'm your host, Brett Dupree, scouring the globe to bring you stories of courage, passion, and resilience. If I could sum up this podcast into one word, I would use empathy. Now let's get inspired. Welcome to the Joyous Expansion Podcast. I am your host, Brett Dupree, here once again to wow you with my dazzling wit and awesome insights. Today's interview is with Nancy Rebecca, a reader in Tacoma, Washington, who has her own mini reading empire there. She does solstice group readings that I've been going to off and on for the last 5 or 6 years, I believe. Time is hard for me lately. I've been getting it wrong a lot. Anyway, first part, of course, of my podcast is talking about my favorite person, me, because if I can't be vulnerable talking about what's going on in my life, how can I ask my guests? Well, let's talk about this. About 1 year ago is when I started recording interviews for my podcast. At one point, I had 10 interviews in the pipe, ready to go. About 6 of them edited, I think, before I even started. It was an interesting time last year around this time. I decided to step up in my life bigly, if you will. I started this podcast. I started taking a leadership role within the district of Toastmasters, the district public relations manager, and I started my own Toastmasters club, the Lightworker Toastmasters, which I talked about in a previous podcast. You should listen to it. I think it's great. Those are 3 big things, and knowing who I am, I knew that was going to be too much for me, to be honest. I knew that was going to shut me down at one point. I knew that was going to be too hard for me. But I decided to go for it anyways, especially at that time. I was still in the midst of a new job that I was starting. I started that job in May, and it was actually a really hard project. A software tester is my day job. I wish I was making money off this podcast. That would be sweet. Of course, as I try to grow myself into the awesome person that I know I am and doing things like this podcast and starting speaking engagements and working on that. But a year ago, I started on this podcast. This is now episode 28. So I'm about probably, I forgot when I launched, but I know I could have looked it up. I tend to just free flow during this part so that it comes off as natural and authentic. And it's a way for me to speak from my heart. But that also means that I mess up on dates. But I believe it was next month when I launched this podcast. I had 4 episodes or 3 episodes. 4 episodes. I launched in the same week. And that, in my opinion, for at least the way I did it, was a mistake because I only had 20 listens that first week, which isn't enough to help me trend on iTunes at all. Not at all. But that is one of the lessons that I learned. When I started my podcast, I was having a conversation yesterday at the Lightworker Toastmasters. And one of my friends, her name is Carrie Dugan. We were talking and she was driving up. She visited. She was not a member. She was driving up and she was thinking about a year ago is when she met me and I was visiting Seriously Funny Toastmasters in Bellevue. It's a great, if you live in Bellevue and want Toastmasters, they're great. Mondays at 6:30, I believe. Crossroads area. I love Toastmasters. And she was talking about how when she first met me, I was like quiet in the room. And during the last year, she noticed how much I changed. And since I met her, she was quiet and shy. And when she spoke, her face just got beet red. And the last year, she has transformed. So I was thinking about how much I've changed over the years since I've started this podcast. Especially how I started this podcast. Because when I started this podcast, I did almost nothing to promote it. And I did nothing to promote it, and then I get upset because no one's watching. And then by nothing to promote it, I wouldn't send an email or a message that the podcast was ready. I would post it on my Facebook page if they were one of my friends and tag them. And that's how I told them that the podcast was ready. I wouldn't actually send them an email. I mean, how silly is that? I mean, that's just basic podcast starting, but that's honestly where I was. I did not have the confidence to start this podcast. I was still in a lower vibration of not being who I am when I started. And that's why I'm where I am in my life for the most part, is I do not recognize how great I am, and I don't recognize things that make me special. I do not recognize that I can help people by who I am and what I've learned and how I speak, and I don't put enough value in that. I am depriving people me. I can help people, and I am depriving them. And one way I'm depriving them is this podcast. When I started this podcast, every part of it was hard, especially going through also starting the Lightworker Toastmasters, especially going through working through that brand new job and hoping out that contract would become full-time, and working through dealing with district politics and trying to do a good job as public relations manager, because I don't want to take a job within the district if I'm not at least going to be good at it. I'm at least going to try. And that was so much. And that's what led to that hiatus that I had, where I had a couple months where I post like one podcast a month, and I didn't have any guests. It was hard for a while. I mean, I had a bunch of guests and doing a bunch of interviews. I didn't do podcast guests, which I am doing now. And you can really tell the difference between the people I recruit and podcast guests due to the fact that podcastguest.com, you can tell the difference, at least I can, in my interviews. The ones that I recruit are people I generally know or know through somebody, and those tend to be more conversational, and they tend to share more about themselves. And the one I get through podcast guests who respond to my ad tend to really feel like they have an agenda, and their agenda is more important than my questions, as they constantly talk about what they do. And I'm just noticing that. And while I prefer talking about themselves, the reason why I prefer talking about themselves is actually simple. I think everything's changing. And one thing that things are changing is people care more about who you are than what you do, even if what you do is great. Even if they're looking, for instance, if they're looking for a person to build them a website, they'll pick the person with the best story, the most authentic, and who has the skill over the person who just maybe have a little bit more skill, but will that person listen to me? Will that person deliver on what I want? People don't trust marketing as much as they used to. People don't trust the message. People buy from friends. And plus, those stories are just more interesting to listen to, at least I think so. And it's not 100%. Like Joe Beck, he was a podcastguest.com host, and I thought his interview was awesome. I liked it. And Cal Rapone is somebody who was also, he shared a lot of his journey. I'm just saying this is more so. They tend to try to pivot it to what they want. It's almost like a fear that they're not going to get out what they want to get out. Like, I'm not going to let them. But anyway, going through this podcast, as I talked before, I've shifted a lot of my views in how I deal with this. For instance, Wednesday evening is automatically podcast day. If I don't do my podcast on Wednesday evening, if I didn't get it done early, it's not going out. And that's because Wednesday is podcast night. This is where I do most of my editing. This is where I record this part. This is where I edit this part. This is where I get it out there. And my goal is to get out there by 11, so I have enough time to talk to my girlfriend, as we generally talk from like 11 to 11:30 every night because we're in love. Aw, how sweet. I also stopped how I viewed editing. Before, editing felt like a slog. Now it feels like a service, because when I edit, and I edit well, I am allowing the person's message to come off as best as possible, totally to serve them and to serve the people who do listen. And I'm grateful for every person who listens. If you're listening to this, I am grateful for you, because that's awesome that somebody's willing to listen to me and to my guests and just listen to my podcast. It's really cool. This whole like sitting here recording and then having somebody listen. I don't know. It's awesome. It's just fun. I started recognizing the fun and how this is part of my path. And I recognize that when I step off my path, that's when I gain weight. That's when I get depressed. That's when I binge watch Netflix. But when I am embracing the aspects of the podcast and focusing on what I love about it, I can feel my life feel better, as I'm now taking up a second podcast, the Church of Awesome podcast, on Seven Stones Radio. You can search Seven Stones Radio and you'll see a little flame. I look forward to getting a better icon. I'm going to pay someone to do that someday. But at the same time, that's the message I got a couple months ago that I need to create. And this is part of my creation. And I love it. I love doing this. This is fun. This is truly, truly fun. I truly enjoy posting these podcasts. And I'm going to do a better job of getting people to listen. My first thing is creating those cards that if you might have seen on my Instagram and Twitter and Facebook and send it out to them so they can share it if they want to. Maybe they can share it periodically and giving them that option. And plus, it makes me feel good. And I think it's cool just to see yourself quoted on something if you're just starting out. And that's a lot of people I like interviewing are the people who are starting out, the people who are working towards it, people who are grinding. I know there's a huge benefit of listening to people who are successful, people who are at the finish line. As Darren LaCroix talked about the 2001 world champion public speaker, that if you want to become successful, you got to speak to the headliner because he was trying to be a comedian. You want to speak to people at the top. So yes, if you want to be successful, yes, listen to the person at the top. But at the same time, listening to other people coming up and going through the same struggles as you, because honestly, when I listen to somebody who's struggling at the top, there's part of me in the back of my mind that they're full of it. When I listen to Mike Dooley, I like Mike Dooley. I've met Mike Dooley. When he talks about how he struggled at the beginning, I don't see that. I don't empathize with that, to be honest. I just see somebody who can sell out an event that's $250 and talk for a day and then get people like me to volunteer for no money to help people. And it was fun. I'm not saying I do that. That was 100% worth the experience. I got to watch, I got to help, and serving is super fun. I'm just saying, like, I see him at the top. And listening to the story as people struggle, so far, I'm inspired. Everybody has helped me keep on going with this podcast. Everyone keeps me wanting to come back. And editing is another way of listening to them, another way to keep me inspired. So honestly, maybe if I don't get listeners ever to this podcast, this thing doesn't take off, this is something that keeps me inspired and it's something that I enjoy. And focusing on that is important. And in this year, I was able to own that. I was able to own that and able to own the fact that I am having a good time and putting more focus on the journey. And finally, because of that, I'm more willing to put it out there and try to get people to listen because I'm not so tied up to the results. Because when I'm just tied up to the results and they don't happen, that's when I kind of freak out. And it's not fun freaking out. To be honest, it's not fun. And I'm done with that. I'm done. I'm breaking the wheel, Jakaris. I am breaking the spokes on the wheel, and the spokes on the wheel are apathy. The spokes on the wheel are disappointment. The spokes of the wheel is fear. The spokes of the wheel is procrastination. The spoke on the wheel is overwhelm. And I'm going to smash it with fire upon this land as I conquer who I am and embrace my awesome self. And speaking of embracing awesome selves, we have an interview today with someone who I think is the most famous person I've interviewed. She is a healer. Her name's Nancy Rebecca. I've known her for 5 or 6 years. I met her a while ago at this youth group that she led, and she does these group healings that I really enjoy going to. I've met a few people through that I still keep in touch with through those groups. I took my girlfriend to one because I like sharing parts about me, and Nancy is a decent part of my life. She's a great person, and I'm honored that she was willing to share her story today. And I'm very excited for you to listen to her interview. Nancy Rebecca is a registered nurse who had a spontaneous out-of-body experience in 1994 after her first attempt to meditate. When she returned to herself, she suddenly had the ability to see energy colors around people, see their guides and angels, and hear someone's thoughts. In the 25 years since, she has created a full-time business teaching others about the importance of a health energy field. And now, here's my interview with Nancy Rebecca. Hello, Nancy, and welcome to my podcast.
Thanks, Brad. How are you?
I am doing great. I am excited to have you on. It's been 5 or 6 years since I met you.
Yeah, I was trying to think about that this morning. I'm trying to remember the first time I met you. Was it a talk that I gave?
Young adult gatherings,
Right.
because Daisha and Jody, may she rest in peace, brought me there.
Yes. Yeah. That was when a lot of information was coming through, and it still is. The young adults, I think, that were born around the year of the 1980s, they were coming in quite different than the kids who had come before or after. Yeah, it was a fascinating time. And yeah, you guys are all still doing really great things.
Yeah, it's so fun watching them grow. One thing I was surprised with how many just decided to move and travel across the world.
I know it. It was that core group that I met with kind of privately because they were going to really build up the group and that they all just had these huge awarenesses that they really wanted to step out into the world and they did in a huge way and still doing. I'm still quite connected with all of them. So it's cool.
That is really neat. Can you tell our listeners what is about you do?
Yeah, so my name is Nancy Rebecca, and my home is in Tacoma, Washington, and I'm a registered nurse by Western medicine kind of standards, Western education standards. Went to nursing school and then I worked in intensive care as an open heart recovery nurse. And then I spent about 7, 8 years as a hospice nurse. When I was a hospice nurse, I was having a lot of stress. I was trying to integrate into the job that is deeply emotional when you're sitting at the bedside of someone's who's end of life care. And then I was having a lot of stress because I had 3 of my own family members going through various stages of the dying process. So it was working all day and then in the evening going to spend with my family. So I went and purchased a book, Brett, on meditation. So this was back in 1994, and I didn't know anyone who meditated. I most certainly didn't know anyone who was involved in metaphysics, even around a campfire one night with a bunch of friends, and a couple of them mentioned going to see a psychic. And I remember my response was, oh, I would never do that. I would be too scared, or that's too weird. So, I mean, I was a pretty traditional mother and wife and nurse and involved in different just normal family activities. So I bought this book and I went through the first chapter, did the exercise in the back, which was nothing more than it says sit quiet, close your eyes and take deep breaths. That was really about the sum of it. And then I went to bed and had a spontaneous out of body experience. You can read more about that on my website and I can get more into it if you want to, but to kind of sum it all up, I had about 40 out of body experiences over a period of about 6 weeks. I couldn't get it to stop. I couldn't find anyone to help me get it to stop. But what happened was I had what I kind of call you can call it a psychic awakening or a spiritual awakening. I don't know what you would call it, but all of a sudden I could see energy fields. I could see, and I didn't know terms for any of this, Brett. I just saw lights around people. I saw more intense lights going up the body, which I now know are chakras. I could see spirits standing behind people, which they were beautiful and golden and bright and loving. At the time, I didn't know that those were spirit guides. Some of them were families who had passed, loved ones who had crossed over. And then I could also hear people's thoughts. So if I was having a conversation with someone about work, maybe I'm at work conversing about case that we're working with, and I could hear the person thinking about what they need to stop and get at the grocery store for dinner that night at the same time. It was quite overwhelming, overstimulating, and just based on the fact that I was a nurse, I thought this must be what it's like when people go crazy. And so, but both my parents are doctors, and I went and talked to them about it. And my mother has her doctorate in psychology, and she convinced me not to go to the hospital. So that was in the early 90s. And so here we are now in 2019. I've ended up making a career out of my abilities because they never went away. So it was like, I want to understand this. So that started my journey of trying to understand what this other world was that no one had ever told me existed.
What was your first step in trying to figure this out?
Wow, that's a great question, Brett. My very first step, at first, I kind of kept it to myself. I started kind of exploring a little bit just when I would be out of my body. So those were kind of my first steps, looking down at my hands or looking down at my feet and then looking at my body in the bed. I started kind of just doing my own little exploration because when I was out of my body, there wasn't much I could do. It was just me, myself, and I there. And then eventually I I needed to find somebody I could talk to about this. I talked to my husband. He was actually quite frightened him, though he wasn't very comforting about it, and also thought that I probably had some mental illness. But both my parents were very comforting. About 6 weeks later, I was losing sleep. So I knew enough as a nurse that if I didn't get some really good, decent sleep, I was probably going to have a psychotic break. And I knew somehow that if that happened, it wasn't going to be good. And so I went to the Yellow Pages. So that was one of my first kind of real reaching outside my own kind of family environment. And I saw 3 listings of a psychic in the Yellow Pages. So I was pretty desperate if I was going to call a psychic. The first 2, they didn't quite know what to do. And the third one I phoned, she suggested that I come in to see her. And so I did. There was actually a group of people. It was actually at the Church of Divine Man. And we're quite blessed to have that. I guess it's kind of like a spiritualist church, but there's one in Everett. I think there's one in Seattle. There used to be one in Tacoma. And so I went over there, and there were a group of very normal people who looked at me like I was having a very normal experience. And they spent about 5 minutes working with my energy field. Then everything was better. I didn't have any more out of body experiences. I felt very grounded. And it was at that moment as a nurse, I thought, our global community, the world at large, people need to know about this, that there are ways that our health and wellness and well-being. What I realized was in 5 minutes, they were able to help me feel better than I had felt my whole life. So I thought this was something that the world needed to know about. And I think in that moment, that was the first step of my journey where it was like, I don't know how I'm going to get this out to people, but it needs to come out from wherever it is in the underground, wherever it's hidden. It needed to come out of the closet, out into the world, and needed to be normalized. And that was 25 years ago. And that's still my vision and my dream moving forward, working with people.
One thing that actually stuck out to me was the emphasis on the word normal, just being around people to make you feel like that what you're going through isn't quote unquote different than what other people went through.
Crazy. Yeah. Well, because I felt, even though no one told me, there was some shame that I felt inside, like I had done something wrong, or maybe I was a bad person. And they were quite unconscious thoughts that kind of startled me when they came to a conscious level. In talking to people in my family and some close friends, I could really, Brett, see the look of fear on their face. Wow, she's really losing it, and we don't know how to fix it. And so they started distancing themselves. I felt just as normal as I feel now. I just was having an abnormal experience. But both my parents were really good at saying, okay, you're not crazy. We don't know what you are, but you're not crazy. So that was really helpful. And even going to the psychic school, they also said, we know what's happening to you is real. We believe you 100%. So let's start getting you more centered and grounded again. And so it was great to be around people who believed that having intuitive abilities, being sensitive, empathic, clairvoyant, hearing sounds or hearing voices or being able to pick up telepathic thoughts, that all those are very, very normal parts of being a human being. But it's been years of what I call programming that has made us believe that it's abnormal, and or people will say often to me, you have a gift. It's like, well, I don't believe I have a gift. I feel like I have normal abilities like everyone else. I've just chosen to cultivate my abilities every day to enhance them at a high skill level. That's something that is of value to me. To see how far these techniques can go in being able to sense and navigate my life and heal myself too.
One thing that I like that you said, that especially is coming up in a lot of my podcast interviews, is the seeking out for help and finding a community. That's a very important aspect. And it's also one of my greatest weaknesses, to be honest, is seeking out for help. So what advice would you give to someone who's had your experiences on how to seek out for help and to make sure that you don't get caught up in some sort of, I don't know, cult or something dangerous?
Yeah, wow, you ask great questions, Brett. So, my husband, who's now my ex-husband, he did think that when I went to this psychic school, the spiritualist church, that was the first place that he went, and many of my friends went, thinking that I was in a cult. And I don't know much about cults, actually, but what I know is that if if they were teaching something in this psychic school that I went to, and I said, I don't agree with that, they would say, gosh, that's really great that you have your own mind and your own opinions about things. And absolutely do not move forward on anything until you know your gut instinct tells you it's right. So I don't know many cults that actually encourage you to have your own mind and your own voice and your own beliefs, and absolutely do not change them for anyone else. And they were always very vocal that way. And so I was allowed to gently unfold at my own pace. What I will say to anyone going through that is to really trust your gut instinct and don't give up. I did almost give up, especially after the first two psychics thought I was crazy. I thought, oh my gosh, if a psychic thinks that I'm crazy, I must be crazy. However, yeah, the big thing is don't give up. Your spirit is going to guide you to the right people or to the right book or to the right class or to the right inner wisdom. Just really trusting that if you just, I call it kind of surrendering it up to God or surrendering it up to your higher self and say, I need help and I need you to find me a good teacher. Your spirit's going to get to work on it right away. And then trust your instincts. Now, it's kind of difficult because sometimes you felt drawn to a workshop or a teacher. You're feeling quite unsettled as you're getting ready to go. You're in the car, you're feeling unsettled. You get into the workshop, you're feeling really unsettled. You're starting to feel anxious. Sometimes that can mean that you're not supposed to be there, but most of the time it means your stuff's coming up and you don't want to look at your own stuff, or your own stuff is scaring you, or your own stuff is unsettling you, or your body's, that ego stuff is coming up and your body's like, don't do that. It could be dangerous. And so you then find yourself listening to those inner fears and not pushing through it. And so for me, it definitely was years, at least 3, 4, or 5 years before I could really discern what was my spiritual voice that was talking and what was my fear voice that was talking. Yeah, that took a while. So that would be my best advice. Don't give up. That's one thing. And ask your spirit, ask God to help find you someone. Because in the spirit world, there's some universal laws, and one of them is free will, that humans have free will to do what they want and what they don't want. And they're equally loved either way. You have to ask for help. They won't intervene or interfere with your path unless you ask them for help to do so. That's really important as well.
I like that. It's very good. Very good advice. You have this psychic awakening and then you decided to take it out in the world. How did you start doing that? What was your first psychic readings like?
Well, in the school that I went to, the psychic school, so it's the Church of Divine Man, and anyone can Google that and find them, and they have lots of great programs and classes and public community events that are free and stuff. I went to school there, and the way that they train you to heal yourself is by using your intuition to do readings on people that walk in from the community. And so the students would get to practice. It's called a student reading, and anyone can go in. They still do it to this day. You can go in, you can get a reading, and I think they're like $45 or something, but they're great readings. I was required as part of my graduation process to do 200, kind of supervised by a high level teacher, do 200 readings for the community. I did this over a period of 2.5 years. And so then I would do the reading, and then I would have the dean would help me to kind of evaluate that process. I had to evaluate myself by using my own intuition. So they'd say, what did you feel like you did well with? What do you feel like you could have improved on? So they would sit there and ask the questions, but I would have to close my eyes and check in with my own inner voice and then respond based on what my spirit was guiding me. The answer would be. So what that helped me to do was build up my trust and faith in my own spirit and my own inner wisdom and my own instincts and intuition. And then when I was reading someone, the whole training is that the only reason why I'm reading another person is so that they can be a mirror for me and reflect back to me what I'm not able to see in myself. And so let's say that someone comes in and they're angry at their father. It's creating an imbalance in their energy field. Then after that reading was complete and the person left, then I would look at issues around my own father. That person was reflecting back to me an area within myself that needed to be healed. But also, we would have people that would come in that were really incredibly wise and dynamic and bright and so filled with love and compassion and joy. And we would read them. And then, it was almost harder, Brett, to look at those reflections of, well, I couldn't see their brightness unless I have brightness. And I couldn't see how dynamic they are without looking at my own dynamic abilities. It was almost easier to look at the angry at the father than it was to look at the love and the compassion and joy that I might hold inside of myself. So the whole process was about me learning about me in those 200 readings. And so then once I graduated from their program, then I just started doing it in the evenings and weekends out of my home for free. People would just come because I wanted to continue to heal myself. I wasn't doing it to develop my skill, and I wasn't doing it to become a full-time psychic, which is what I do now. I was only doing it to heal myself. And then over time, I just started getting more calls and more calls and more calls. And so the work was really speaking to people, was calling to their soul. People were hungering to know what their soul had to say about them and wanted to illuminate in them. As a nurse, that just really filled my heart, warmed my heart to be able to communicate soul to soul with someone else. And I still say after 25 years, I have the best job in the world. Yeah, does that answer your question?
It does.
Yeah.
So what was it like to first start charging people?
That was hard. That was really, really hard, especially for me, because my nature is I'm very generous. That's just a part of my soul. That's just a part of who I am. I'm generous, with my time and generous with money and generous with what I have and go out of my way to help other people. That was who I was. And I still will say to this day, if there was any way I could get a salary to just pay my light bill, I would do this for free all the time. But the first time I started charging, so I was doing this for free, Brett, and people started giving me tips. And it'd be $10 or it'd be $20, and it was $50, and then I was getting tips of $100. And I thought, okay, so clearly people are enjoying their sessions so much that they're tipping me. Maybe I should start charging. So I started at $25 because, and it's interesting, I always wanted it to be affordable for people. So I went from 25 and then eventually I built up to $45 a reading, and then I built up to 75, and then it was 125. Now you have to understand this is 25 years of process. And then my guides, every time, Brett, it was my guides, my own spirit that told me I needed to charge more. I needed to raise my prices. And each time I couldn't do it. And so I would have to personally just keep working on myself and then working on my issues around money. See, I was raised very poor. My childhood upbringing was quite a few years in poverty and on welfare, hiding. If we were on welfare, they used to come in these white label with black letters, all the foods. So everybody in the neighborhood would know if you had that white label, black letter food in your garbage can, then you were poor and on welfare. So there was a lot of shame around money as well. And knowing what it was like to live in poverty, I didn't want anyone to struggle. So I'll tell you one of my big I've had a couple of those eye-opening experiences, but one was someone told me they couldn't afford a reading. And I think I was charging 125 at the time. So I took $100 off, charged them $25. And when they came in for the reading at $25, they were telling how excited they were that they got the new, I don't even know about televisions, but a huge, gigantic, like I knew it was easily a $4,000 television. And so it was like, wow, they couldn't afford to pay me, and I'm eating beans or maybe can't pay my light bill, and they can afford a television. So that started really reflecting to me where I was so out of balance around money. And then eventually I went up to 250, and now my current prices are 400. And it had gotten to a place where my overhead, having a website and having a teaching space, all of those things are overhead that require to be paid for. But each time my guides would guide me what price and that I needed to raise it. And I have to tell you, Brett, every time my guides told me something, it still took me about a year before I could get my head in that space to go ahead and do it. I kept thinking I was going to lose customers or lose clients, or it would not be affordable for people. But each time turned out not to be a truth.
So what made you want to take things to be even bigger, to create your own healing center and start doing group readings and all those fun things?
I was actually guided to. I was working as a nurse. The first time the guidance came through, remember, I was doing it out of my home. And then I started kind of traveling to people's offices. And so there were therapists, doctors, nurses, other people that they would call and ask for readings. So word was already spreading. And so I was just going to people's offices. And anyway, someone gave me an office. So I remember saying, well, I don't ever plan to do this as a career, but they gave it to me for free and let me have it for free to see if I could build up my business. And then I did. And then I started paying rent. And then the same thing each time my guides would say, like doing group readings. My guides were saying, we want you to work with larger groups of people to raise consciousness, to help people remember that they're a soul having a human experience, to bring it out of the closet, to normalize it. And so every time I went bigger, they would come and ask me to go bigger again. And my nature is actually quite shy. I was a shy child growing up. I'm always having to push against that shyness, just keep answering spirit. So the way I look at life is that I work for the spirit realm. I always say my boss is God. And if they're asking me to do something, I feel like I've been placed here on earth to help the divine, help the spirit realm do the work that they need humans to help do. So if that's guiding a meditation, if that's helping someone to realize that they have value and a place in the world, that they belong here, and that's what I do. I just keep listening to spirit. So there are times where I have really thrown conniption fits. And I've actually yelled out loud saying, what you expect of me is much more than what I'm capable of doing. But then I calm down and I do it anyway. And it's the same with the Intuitive Mind Center that's at 27th and Bridgeport and University Place. I just went to drop off my vacuum cleaner and the spirit world became very loud and said, we want you to take the center and make it a teaching space. And I said, no, I'm not doing it. It's hard to describe to people, but if you imagine you're at a rock concert and you're waiting for your favorite rock band to come out on the stage and people are starting to cheer and yell and scream or sing or try to raise the vibration so the band will come out, and then the band comes out. There's this huge roar of celebration because in anticipation you've been excited. Well, it's that way for me in the spirit world. It begins with this kind of low roar, and it can get louder, and it can be so loud it can sound like a low flying jet engine over my head when they're getting especially loud. And that loudness will remain until I say yes. When this happened when I got the space, I said, okay, I will call the lease department and see how much the lease is. So Then it got quiet. Every time I say I'll follow through, it gets quiet. If I don't follow through, it remains loud. So I phoned, and the leasing agent said the space has been empty for 3 years. We'll give it to you for free for 6 months to see if you can make something out of it. And then we'll only charge you $1,000 a month after that for another 6 months. And we won't make you sign a lease so that if it doesn't work out, you can walk away and everybody's a winner. And so that's how spirit works, Brett. It's like I have found in my experience, if I listen, the spirit world rewards me in ways that I can't even imagine with my own mind. I mean, who does that? Who gives you a free space? Who gives you a free space that's 1,400 square feet to see if you can start a teaching center? So that's how it works for me. And so it's nice. The past couple of years, they've given me a little bit of a break. They're still pushing me on some things, but it's not as loud as it's been in the past. So I think I'm listening more often. I'm listening more often now, so I don't get the big jet engine loudness.
Cool. So when working with other people, just curious, do you have any favorite success stories?
Mm, wow. Gosh, there's so many. Hmm. Well, the one that's coming to the surface, so I'll just talk about that one first. It was a woman who I think she had like 8 kids, and I think maybe she had about 6 grandkids. So she had some kids that were already adult enough to have their own children, and then still had some kids at home. And she was quite severely depressed. She was crying quite a bit. She was feeling quite isolated, exhausted. She didn't feel like she was a good mother. She hadn't been able to work in about 3 years. I didn't know at the time that I first talked to her, but she was a pretty heavy drinker, so alcohol. And I didn't know this until it came up in the reading. She came in to have a session. She was pretty desperate, and she wanted me to take a look at her energy field to see if I could see any obvious imbalances or maybe see what some of her core issues might be. She had never done anything like that before. We did the session. I was able to really find some core issues from childhood. We were able to shift some of those. I was able to help her shift out some of the really in-depth core depression that she had from an early age. Right afterwards, she phoned me about 5 days later. She had no depression. She hadn't cried. She was finding joy with her kids and her grandkids. She had been on antidepressants. She chose to go off. I don't recommend people go off their antidepressants, especially that shortly after a reading, and most certainly not without checking with their doctor or their therapist. So I'll just say that I am a nurse, so I'm pretty logical about that piece. She ended up getting a full-time job as a teacher again at a school within the month, and she stopped drinking. She never touched alcohol again, and she actually made an appointment with her doctor to tell her doctor about the profound shift in her, and she felt like all medical people needed to know about this. That was one of the biggest, most dramatic in a short period of time. But I see about 12 people a week and have for 25 years. So what I would say is in the beginning as a nurse, I was surprised that people had results like this. And now I expect to see results like this for people who come to see me. And so some people come for medical issues. Most people come because they're unhappy. Some people come because they're on a spiritual journey and they want to enhance their spiritual journey. A lot of people in love, like relationships, people are really struggling nowadays. There's a lot of people living alone and they're not in relationships. So they're trying to figure out why they're blocking relationships, and family. If they're feeling isolated from their family or they feel different from their family. So lots of different people for lots of different reasons will find their way to see me, and it's usually word of mouth. They'll hear from other people who've come that they just feel a lot better. I have a lot of stories. That's why I'm always onto myself about getting my book finished, because I have so many stories to share.
Yeah, speaking of so many stories to share, we are coming towards the end of our podcast, and I only felt like we scratched the surface on anything that is Nancy, Rebecca.
Well, they can go to the website and they can read more for sure.
So one thing I like to ask my listeners is to give a 1 minute of motivation. One way to think about this is you're in a time machine and you go back down to your 8-year-old self. But you only have a minute to convey the information that you need at 8 years old, or that you can take your entire life's work and cram it down to 1 minute of motivation.
Well, the big thing that I'm always talking about is grounding. So, in talking to your listeners, if I say if there's one thing that I feel that each person would find as very life enhancing is to be very well grounded to the earth, getting out in nature, sitting under a tree, or even sitting in your own home, in the comfort of your own home, and just imagining you're this really strong ancient tree with a very deep root system that really helps anchor your soul all the way down into your body. You are a spirit having a human experience, and it's time for our soul to work in harmony with our human self, not just our human self making all the decisions, but this team member that you have is your soul. And the more grounded you are, the more soul comes into your body. And when your soul comes into your body, that's where all the magic and the miracles happen. You can get your inner wisdom. You can know what delights your soul. You know what makes you happy. You want to be surrounded by those who are very grounded and present. It's time. This is a great time of change. We're all waking up. We need grounding more than ever now. That's the big thing. Nature and grounding is the big motivational message that I would like to leave everyone.
Awesome, Nancy. Thank you so much for coming on my podcast. It has been an honor to have you on, as I've known you for the last 5 years, and to watch you grow has been inspiring for me.
Thank you.
I've heard your story multiple times, and
Yes,
each
we have.
time, so coming from something until becoming something even bigger is extremely inspiring, especially for readers. And I know a lot of readers who struggle and just try to get person to person, but to see somebody who's out there doing it, I think is extremely important to seeing what you can become. And you're the most successful reader that I know. And so thank you for sharing your wonderful story with us.
Thank
And thank you
you.
for being on my podcast.
Thanks so much, Brad. It was wonderful talking to you and your listeners.
I hope your day is special.
Thank you. You too. Bye-bye.
And there you have it, folks. Nancy Rebecca. Wow. It's fun interviewing a psychic. We were talking before the podcast, and she was talking about one of her friends who his podcast didn't, or her, I don't remember the gender, their podcast, because I can say that. That's a gender neutral term. Their podcast didn't really make it big until 200, and then people started going back and backfill listening. You have to wonder, was she telling me that because she's trying to help keep me motivated? Or is she telling me that because maybe in the future I'm that friend and she's having a vision of the future? No, it's interesting. I've known Nancy for years and I've listened to parts of that story many times, and it's, I think, entertaining each time to listen to it. It is a person who has great calling and for the most part, for a lot of part, resisted her calling, and then kept on going forward and listening to spirit, listening to those inner guides, and eventually turned her mystical awakening into a thriving business. And that's so cool. She has done a lot of things. Bone divination. She's part of the Sagoma tribe, I believe it is. She does so many things. She teaches people how to awake their psychic skills. She teaches meditation. She does so many. Yeah, she has an online course. She has a year-long course. She has a lot of things. And I'm always impressed by her. And she's authentic when you talk to her. She's how you talk to her on the podcast. She's a authentic person who I enjoy very much. I consider her a friend of mine. And yeah, I always enjoy seeing her. I always get a big hug and having a good conversation. And I do appreciate Nancy. So it was really cool getting her on a podcast and having an actual conversation and hopefully sharing her out to more people. And as you can see from the beginning, somebody I know, so she's more comfortable with me, and I'm not Mark Maron, so I'm just not great at getting that out of anybody, but she's comfortable and she was able to share a lot about her past, and it was really cool listening to it and how more and more she's stepping up and more she's gaining success. And I think that is very inspiring. At least I am inspired by her story. Hope you are too. If you want to know more about Nancy Rebecca, I highly suggest you go to her website, www.intuitivemind.org. She has a free gift for you to learn your intuitive style, a fun little questionnaire. Plus, you can learn more about her courses. She has a way for you to get free healing from one of her students, I believe. And she has psychic programs, home study programs, group reading, online classes. I highly suggest you go out and check her out. It's really, she's a really cool person. So check her out. And that is this episode of the Joyous Expansion Podcast, the 28th episode, if you will. That number is important to me because my birthday is on a 28th. 28th is, of course, your golden birthday. So this feels like it's my golden podcast. And I'm super excited to have Nancy as my 28th podcast. Again, I am your host, Brett Dupree, your Joyous Expansion Life Coach, champion of authentic joy, catalyst of transformation, and Grand Poobah cult leader of the Church of Awesome. If you want to email me, if you have a question, or if you just want to tell me how awesome I am, you can send me an email at BRE2Ts, at joyousexpansion.com. Of course, at joyousexpansion.com, I have a free gift for you, how to break through your prisons of fear, as I did as well, and continue to do to this day. You can listen to more of my podcasts at pod.joyousexpansion.com. I'm on Stitcher, I'm on iTunes, I'm on Podbean, and a few other places. If you find me on there, give me a like, give me a review, give me stars that you believe I deserve. Those help a lot. Share this if you so incline. That would be awesome as well. I'd appreciate you forever to share this out there and tell people how great it is. Because if you share it and like, this sucks, that doesn't help at all. And so there you have it, folks. Hope you have an amazing day. I am Brett Dupree, once again reminding you to be joy, to be love, to be awesome. Now play my jingle.
JoyousExpansion.com. JoyousExpansion.com. Come and say hello to Brett Dupree. He is an inspirational life coach, good for you and good for me. He turned my life from grey to blue, I'm sure he'll do the same for you. Get in touch and you'll see your life will change dramatically. JoyousExpansion.com. JoyousExpansion.com. Yeah.